Did you know that one of the deadliest gunmen in the Old West wasn't a train bandit, wasn't a saloon brawler, and never once stepped into the kind of dramatic high-noon duel Hollywood loves to show us? Instead, he dressed like a gentleman, carried himself like a churchgoer, and lived behind the facade of a pious man. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, and never cursed. To his neighbors, he seemed respectable, maybe even admirable. Yet beneath that mask was a ruthless killer who made his living with a shotgun, quietly assassinating men for money. His name was James Brown Miller, better known as Killin Jim Miller, or by the chillingly ironic nickname, Deacon Jim. Unlike Billy the Kid or Jesse James, Miller never sought fame, never courted headlines, and never basked in the outlaw spotlight. He was something colder, something darker, a professional killer in cowboy boots. In an age when most outlaws were chasing notoriety, Miller was selling death like a craftsman selling his trade. For decades, he slipped through the fingers of justice, leaving behind trails of blood and suspicion. Time and again, he was arrested. Time and again, he walked free. But eventually, even a man like Miller couldn't outrun the consequences of his bloody career. This is his story. James Brown Miller was born on October 25, 1861, in Van Buren, Arkansas, as the Civil War raged across the nation. His father, Jacob, was a stonemason of some skill, a man who had helped lay the stone for the very first Capitol building in Austin, Texas. His mother, Cynthia, came from Tennessee. The family moved to Texas when James was barely a year old, settling in Franklin. Life on the frontier was never easy, but for young Jim, tragedy seemed to arrive faster than for most. His father died when Jim was still a boy, leaving the family adrift and vulnerable. From that point on, James was passed between relatives, never settling into the comfort of a stable home. And then, when he was just 8 years old, violence came crashing into his life in a way that would cast a shadow over him forever. His grandparents, with whom he was living at the time, were found murdered inside their home. The crime shocked the community. Whispers spread. Some even pointed their fingers at young James himself. Was the boy somehow involved? Could a child really commit such a crime? He was briefly arrested but never prosecuted, and the case was swallowed up in silence. Still, the suspicion lingered, and the stain of death never seemed to wash away from him. James eventually moved in with his older sister Georgia and her husband John Coop, who farmed near Gatesville, Texas. For a while, it seemed like he might find a fresh start there. But the violence that had followed him since childhood was not done with him. On the night of July 30th, 1884, when he was just 23 years old, Jim Miller committed his first confirmed killing. His victim was none other than his own brother-in-law, John Coop. Coop had been sitting peacefully on his porch when Miller raised a shotgun and ended his life in an instant. The reasons for the murder remain cloudy. Some say it was the result of a heated argument. Others believe Miller snapped without warning. Either way, the young killer was quickly arrested, tried, and convicted. The court sentenced him to life in prison. But Miller's strange relationship with the law began right here. His conviction was overturned on a technicality, and he walked free. It would become the first of many times justice tried to cage him, only for him to slip out through some crack in the system. From that moment forward, Miller began shaping the image that would define him for the rest of his life. While other gunslingers boasted of their draw speed and chased notoriety in saloons, Miller crafted the opposite persona. He dressed neatly, wore black frock coats and wide-brimmed hats, kept his hair combed, and carried himself with a calm, reserved air. He never drank alcohol, never smoked, never cursed. He attended Methodist church regularly, sang hymns in the choir, and even carried a Bible under his arm. It was this carefully cultivated facade that earned him the ironic nickname, Deacon Jim. But behind the hymns and politeness, he was already walking the path of a professional killer. Miller's reputation as a violent man only grew when he tied himself to one of the most dangerous families in Texas. He married Sally Clements, the daughter of a notorious clan whose blood ties stretched to Emmanuel Mannon Clements, a cousin of Wes Hardin. one of the deadliest gunfighters in Texas history. The Clemens family lived knee-deep in feuds, revenge killings, and violence. For Jim Miller, marrying Sally wasn't just about love. It was about protection, power, and positioning himself within a network of killers who understood the value of blood debts. With them at his back, Miller's bloody career found room to flourish. Unlike most gunmen of the Old West, Miller had no interest in standing face-to-face in the middle of a dusty street. He wasn't interested in boasting about his revolver speed or carving a name for himself in flashy shootouts. He was a planner, a man who preferred ambush over confrontation. His weapon of choice was the shotgun, and he wielded it with ruthless efficiency. While others might challenge their enemies under the open sky, Miller waited in the shadows, struck from cover, and left his victims bleeding in the dirt before they even knew he was there. If other outlaws lived by the revolver, Miller lived by the quiet thunder of a shotgun blast. By the early 1890s, whispers began to spread. If you had a problem that needed solving, and if you had enough money, you could go to Jim Miller. For a fee ranging anywhere from $50 to a few thousand, he would put your enemy in the ground. Some said he killed more than 50 men this way. Even if the number was exaggerated, the sheer scope of his career makes him one of the most prolific assassins in frontier history. One of Miller's most infamous rivalries came with Sheriff Bud Frazer of Pecos County. Miller had been working as a deputy sheriff in Pecos, but his methods quickly drew suspicion. Sheriff Frazer accused him of corruption and abuse, and their conflict escalated into outright hatred. In 1894, Frazer ambushed Miller, shooting him multiple times. To everyone's shock, Miller survived. That survival sparked one of the most enduring legends about him, that he wore a steel breastplate beneath his coat, a hidden shield that explained why bullets seemed unable to kill him. Whether it was true or not, it gave Miller an aura of invincibility. 2 years later, Miller repaid the insult with deadly interest. Inside a saloon in Toyah, Texas, Miller ambushed Frazer with his shotgun, blowing him away instantly. Once again, Miller was arrested, tried, and indicted. And once again, he walked free when the case collapsed under the weight of weak evidence and a skilled defense. Every acquittal only fed the legend that Deacon Jim Miller was a man beyond the reach of law. But Miller's killings weren't only fueled by feuds. He became the assassin of choice for men with money and enemies. In Lubbock, Texas, a lawyer named James Jarrett had made enemies by representing farmers against powerful cattle interests. For a payment of $500, Miller waited on a lonely country road and blasted Jarrett from his buggy. In Fort Worth, a businessman named Frank Four threatened to expose Miller's fraudulent land schemes. Four was gunned down in a hotel washroom. Suspicion pointed directly at Miller, but juries never seemed willing to convict him. Time and again he emerged unscathed, his name growing darker with every trial he escaped. Outwardly, Miller kept up his image of respectability. He attended church, carried his Bible, and lived as though butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. But his neighbors whispered, and those whispers carried fear. Everyone knew Deacon Jim was not what he seemed. By 1908, Miller was living in Fort Worth, Texas, his reputation known across the plains. That year, he took on what would become his final job, the killing of A.A. Gus Bobbitt, a respected former U.S. Deputy Marshal in Ada, Oklahoma. Bobbitt had made enemies among wealthy ranchers and shady businessmen. 3 of them, Jesse West, Joe Allen, and Barry Burrell, wanted him gone. They reached out to the man they knew could handle it, Jim Miller. The price was $1,700, a small fortune at the time. On the morning of February 27, 1909, Miller and an accomplice waited near Bobbitt's ranch. As Bobbitt drove his wagon home with supplies, Miller rose from his cover and fired his shotgun into the lawman's side. But unlike most of Miller's victims, Bobbitt didn't die instantly. He staggered, bloodied and broken, and with his final breaths cried out Miller's name. "Jim Miller shot me." Witnesses heard it. His words sealed Miller's fate. Miller fled toward Texas but was captured by Rangers and hauled back to Ada, where he was jailed alongside West, Allen, and Burrell. For many in Ada, this was déjà vu. They had seen this man in court before. They knew his history of acquittals, technicalities, and slick lawyers. They feared justice would once again slip through their fingers. But this time, the people of Ada were not willing to let it happen. In the early hours of April 19, 1909, a mob of between 30 and 200 men stormed the jail. They overpowered the guards, dragged Miller and his 3 co-conspirators out of their cells, and marched them to a livery stable behind the jail. Ropes were prepared, rafters were chosen. Even then, Miller remained calm, almost eerily so. He asked that his diamond ring be sent to his wife. He requested to die wearing his black hat. His wish was granted. When the noose was slipped over his neck, he looked at the men surrounding him and, with a strange smile, spoke his final words. "Let her rip." Moments later, he swung into the void, alongside the very men who had hired him. The lynching shocked the region, but was met with quiet approval from many. For decades, the courts had failed to contain Jim Miller. In the end, it wasn't judges or juries that ended him. It was the people themselves, taking justice into their own hands. Miller's body was returned to Texas and buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Fort Worth, where his grave can still be found today. After his death, rumors swirled like wildfire. Some claimed Miller had confessed to killing 51 men. Others insisted he wore a steel breastplate under his clothes, explaining his uncanny survival in so many gunfights. Historians doubt some of the higher numbers, but even the confirmed killings are enough to mark him as one of the most prolific assassins in the history of the American frontier. And yet, unlike Billy the Kid or Jesse James, Jim Miller never became a legend in popular imagination. There were no dime novels painting him as a romantic outlaw, no Hollywood films elevating him into myth. Perhaps it was because his crimes lacked the glamour of robberies and rebellion. He didn't fight the system. He didn't challenge the law in dramatic duels. He simply killed for money, quietly and efficiently, like a tradesman doing a job. He wasn't a rebel. He wasn't a hero. He was a businessman in murder. And maybe that is what makes him so unsettling. Because James "Killin Jim" Miller reminds us that the Wild West was not all shootouts at high noon, and legendary outlaws with larger-than-life reputations. It was also ambushes, hired killers, and quiet men in black hats waiting with a shotgun in the brush. He lived by the gun, thrived on the loopholes of the law, and finally died at the end of a rope, not condemned by a judge, but by a town that had grown tired of waiting for justice. So the next time you think of the Wild West, remember Killin Jim Miller. Not every outlaw became a legend. Some became nightmares. And Miller's nightmare still lingers in the shadows of history, a reminder that beneath the myths and the romance, the frontier could be as cold and ruthless as the man they called Deacon Jim. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another dark and untold tale of the Wild West. And tell us in the comments, do you think the people of Ada were right to take justice into their own hands? Or should Miller have faced one last trial in court?